Modern Russia's most famous mutineer is back in Russia.
Евгения Викторовича Пригожина, он находится в Питере.
The news delivered there by Belarusian president and Putin ally Alexander Lukashenko. Yevgeny Prigozhin was allowed to flee to Belarus after his failed mutiny, but according to Lukashenko, the Wagner mercenary boss is now in St. Petersburg. The intrigue over Russian disunity comes as NATO prepares for a pivotal summit. Leaders of all NATO countries will gather in Vilnius, Lithuania next week, less than 200 kilometers from the Belarusian capital. On the agenda, the future of Ukraine's NATO membership bid. For more on this, I'm joined by Keir Giles. He is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. Keir Giles, it's great to speak with you again.
Hello.
So here we are, less than 2 weeks after Prigozhin launched a failed rebellion, and somehow he's back in Russia and in St. Petersburg. What do we make of this?
Well, we're told he's back in Russia and we're told he's in St. Petersburg. But I think, unfortunately, this is one of those situations that you sometimes come up against in Russia where you really can't tell what's going on because there just aren't any reliable sources of information. So on the face of it, yes, Prigozhin seems to have not only survived, but also returned. We're told to pick up some of his cash, $110 million worth of it, and a couple of weapons, and is still roaming free around Russia just a couple of weeks after he mounted an armed mutiny against the Russian state, which you're not supposed to be able to survive. But what exactly is going on, we won't know until Prigozhin does resurface for real. And then, of course, there's the question of all of the men that were under his command who also seem not to have turned up in Belarus where they were supposed to be. They, too, are going to be a challenge to the Russian state because it's going to be hard to integrate them into the MOD or release them into society.
You make an excellent point that we don't have clear sources of information inside Russia, so we don't really precisely know what's going on with Prigozhin, but it appears he's not in custody. People are surprised by that, or that he's, to be blunt, not dead at this point. I mean, what does the fact that he's free and alive tell you about Putin's grip on power in Russia?
It's a very dangerous precedent for Putin because here's somebody who has stood up against the state, and this sets a precedent that others will follow. Because if we see Prigozhin is not only alive, but also able to retain some of the things that were supposed to be confiscated off him by the state and return from exile, what does that say to the other people who might be feeling ready to mount a challenge against Putin and against the central state authorities? So I think it's clear this will not be the last incident of this kind, precisely because Putin has not dealt with it decisively.
You know, there's been some analysis that this Prigozhin short-lived rebellion amounted to a silent referendum on Putin. And the fact that he was able to march on Moscow with really little resistance is bad news for Putin. So, I mean, could this be the beginning of the end for the Russian president?
Well, there too, we don't have exactly a clear picture of just how much resistance there really was. We know that, astonishingly, Prigozhin's people actually managed to shoot down 7 Russian aircraft on the way to Moscow. So something was going on, and yet this too, he's been forgiven. What is clear is that there wasn't serious opposition along the way. So he not only nonchalantly breezed into the military headquarters in that southern city of Rostov-na-Don, but also other units that were supposed to obstruct him on the way seem to have failed to do so and acquiesced in the coup. So in that respect, yes, it shows that there are opposition to Putin that actually has sympathy among the military and the security forces. And that, too, is a dangerous situation for power in Russia.
Okay, so while this chaos and this uncertainty plays out in Russia, NATO leaders are going to meet next week for a pretty important summit. And on the agenda, of course, is Ukraine. What do you want to see, expect to see come out of this summit with regard to NATO support for Ukraine moving forward?
Well, the tragedy, of course, is that there's been a very clear dividing line set in Europe. Countries that are within NATO will be protected. Those that are outside NATO will not. And that is why Ukraine is pushing for membership of NATO at the earliest possible moment. Countries like Finland and Sweden have found themselves on the wrong side of that line and taken the jump. Immediately, they saw that that was demonstrated to join NATO as rapidly as possible. Ukraine, unfortunately, won't have that option, not only because there is an ongoing conflict with Russia at the moment, which means that it cannot be accepted under current terms, but also there's internal opposition within the alliance. Some of the biggest breaks on support for Ukraine, ironically, come from its biggest supporters, like the United States. Certainly the greatest contributor by volume of military support and material to Ukraine, but also the country that's doing so with one foot on the brake, fearful of a Russian response. Put it all together, and it's very unlikely that there will be a decision in Vilnius that will be satisfactory for Kiev.
So what do you say to people who had that one foot on the brake, fearful of a Russian response? That people might suggest that increasing military aid for Ukraine could risk provoking Putin into escalating this conflict.
It is bewildering after all of the repetitive cycles we've seen where that theory has been disproven. Putin has created a very successful image of somebody that will escalate, and escalate by now is always taken as a synonym for use a nuclear weapon if anything happens that displeases him. And yet, time and again, that's shown to be an empty threat. The West ought to have learned by now that this is purely an information operation. It's not backed up by action. And the safest thing for Europe is actually to ensure a swift and conclusive Russian defeat, because that pushes back the time when Russia can regroup and actually have a go again. Vladimir Putin's made it very clear that his ambition doesn't stop at Ukraine. So keeping the whole of the continent safe means assisting Ukraine in actually making sure that Russia is neutralized as a military threat.
Right, and so just as a final point on that, because on the agenda in Vilnius is some sort of clarity over Ukraine's NATO membership bid. There's enthusiasm for it in Eastern Europe and some hesitation for it the further away you get from the battle lines. Where do you see things in the short and the medium term in terms of Ukraine being part of this alliance?
Well, you've summed it up. There's a gradient of perception in Europe. The closer you get to Russia, the more you realize the necessity of keeping everybody together in solidarity to withstand the Russian threat. Countries further away think that distance lends them security. But what everybody hopes is going to be avoided is a repeat of what happened at a similar NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, when both Ukraine and Georgia were told, yes, you can be members, but not now. And that, of course, was the ultimate red flag to Russia, and Russia shortly afterwards invaded Georgia, more or less as a result of this invitation that wasn't. Now, we're hoping that there will not be that same mistake again, saying to Ukraine, yes, you will be a NATO member, but we're not doing anything about it now. In order for Europe to be safer, there has to be something more concrete and more specific that comes out of this summit.